So far we've talked about epidemiology, physiology, and surgical technology, but of course as humans there's more to it than that. And our next speaker, Stephen Svoboda, will come to address that. He graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1991, and prior to receiving this honor he worked as a Harvard Human Rights Fellow in documenting and working to stop human rights violations in Guatemala. From 1997 to the present, he's been founder and executive director of Attorneys for the Rights of the Child, a non-profit network working to eliminate genital mutilation and studying related legal and ethical issues. This afternoon, he's going to grapple with some of the ethical and human rights issues which surround the scientific questions discussed thus far, and his talk is entitled Where Science, Ethics, and Human Rights Meet.
My first task is to put this thing on successfully. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, I've been asked to speak briefly about the anthropological issues behind the development of circumcision, so I'm just going to do a quick overview of those. It started about 5,000 years ago in Egypt, as far as we know. Some people speculate it may have started as long ago as 15,000 years ago, as a sacrificial rite primarily. And with all sacrificial rites, it's not worth anything unless you sacrifice something that's valuable. The ancient people obviously considered the prepuce to be worth something, or else it wouldn't have been a sacrificial object. And in some ways it was an ideal sacrificial object, given that it could be taken away, the male's reproductive ability would obviously not be affected, and yet the male would suffer a permanent impairment of sexual enjoyment. Now that's been known for a long time. Moses Maimonides in the 11th century talked about how circumcision was recommended and salutary for Jews to do, and the very reason was that it weakened the sexual pleasure, and that was considered a beneficial thing to do, to make the male and the female more connected and bond together better, rather than the male was more focused on his own sexual enjoyment. So that's been known for a long time. In sub-Saharan Africa, circumcision of males and excision of females are done together. The prepuce is seen as a feminine, essentially, aspect of the male body, and the clitoris is seen as a male aspect of the female body. Therefore, according to their thinking, both the clitoris and the prepuce need to be removed. As some of you probably know, Jewish religious circumcisions typically take place on the 8th day following birth. Muslim circumcisions, on the other hand, take place anywhere from birth until early adulthood, depending on the culture. Jewish circumcision today, however, does not resemble the practice that originally started back in the time of Abraham. It was a much more minimal procedure than just the tip. The very tip of the prepuce was removed today. It's the same procedure, essentially, that's done in hospitals, where the prepuce is removed entirely, along sometimes with other parts of the intact penis as well. In U.S. history, in the U.S., circumcision was introduced into the medical profession a little over a century ago. They wanted to stop masturbation, which, as I'm sure all you learned doctors know, is the cause of all illness. At the time, they thought that masturbation caused convulsions, paralysis, epilepsy, eczema, chancre, elephantiasis, gangrene, tuberculosis, hip joint diseases, hernia, impotence, convulsions, hysteroepilepsy, whatever that is, and a bunch of other things I got written down here I don't have time to say. So it's taken pretty seriously in those days. In the 1920s and 1930s, experts preyed on fear of venereal disease, including syphilis and gonorrhea, to justify circumcision. In the 50s, the foreskin was faulted with causing cervical and penile cancers. Those studies have been disproven, by the way. Well, penile cancer, it is true that it is associated with circumcision, but it occurs in about 1 out of 100,000 males, and it's questionable whether it's ethical or legally justified to perform this procedure, which does have complications on all males, to try to stop 1 in 100,000 cancers, which usually occur at a very advanced age as well. One complication I haven't heard mentioned today so far is a pretty major complication. It's called death. 2 studies which have looked at the issue have shown that between 200 and 250 boys die a year due to circumcision in the U.S. Now, granted, all those aren't written down as circumcisions in the medical papers, but one documented case recently happened, was in the papers, where a boy died from a circumcision, and it was put down as complications of procedures used to try to correct the problems from the circumcision. Then later they went back and changed the reason for death to hemorrhage, without mentioning that the hemorrhage was a direct result, a proximal result of the circumcision. So it's interesting to be here today and hear talks about STDs and how are those related to circumcision. I think the studies that have been done are very interesting to look at. I think there's some factors that have been left out, which I'm going to talk about today. I do want to say, though, that it's interesting to me, how do we get to this place where we're even debating this issue? This odd situation that was pointed out by a question about, we seem to do this because we're used to doing this, and we don't seem to talk about doing it with any other intact body part. And I wonder if anybody here's thought about using female genital mutilation to stop UTIs in females, urinary tract infections in females. I don't hear that being proposed seriously, and I think a lot of the reason for that is just the cultural difference that we in the US, probably not some of the audience here today, because I know we have an international audience, but we in the US are used to male circumcision, we're not used to female. Male seems okay, male seems to have relatively little harm. We haven't really looked into the harm extensively with documented research, and that's something that I hope some physicians get around to doing at some point, because I think there's a chance we'll find some interesting results there too. Peer organizations, no national or international medical association endorses routine infant circumcision anywhere in the world. Circumcising physicians therefore stand isolated from their peer organizations. However, associations which have issued statements which failed to endorse routine infant circumcision include the American Academy of Pediatrics, British Medical Association, the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Australian Medical Association, Australian College of Pediatrics, and the Australasian Association of Pediatric Surgeons. There's other organizations too, American Cancer Society and others. In March 1999, the American Academy of Pediatrics concluded that the data are not sufficient to recommend routine neonatal circumcision. They did fudge some of their other findings a bit, as Dr. Wiswell pointed out, but their overall conclusion was the data are not sufficient to recommend routine neonatal circumcision. That's in a country where the majority of baby boys are still being circumcised. The AAP still was able to see that, so that's quite an interesting finding. The Australasian Association of Pediatric Surgeons concluded there was no medical indications for neonatal circumcision, and that is an affront to bodily integrity. We'll talk about that a bit later. Actually, we'll talk about it now. Bodily integrity. A lot of us are, perhaps all of us are from cultures which are used to regarding autonomy, respect, bodily integrity as important factors to safeguard throughout our lives. We're also used to the idea that when we make decisions about our medical care that affect us that aren't emergency type situations, we get to give consent or not give consent ourselves. Failure to obtain informed consent renders any bodily intrusion an assault. It gets a little, the analysis gets a little mucked up with the case of parents and children, because children obviously can't consent themselves. However, the typical situation is the parental assent, which is really the right term, not consent, but assent. Parental assent for an operation on a child is justified if there's an exigent medical emergency or some other medical reason that justifies the procedure. In the case of circumcision, we're typically talking about dangers that are far off in the future. In the case of sexually transmitted diseases, we're talking about dangers that are going to arise primarily in adulthood. Now, it's highly questionable whether you can ethically justify performing a procedure on a newborn, which does cause pain, with or without analgesia, based on a hypothetical speculation that in 18 years they're not going to perform certain practices that might reduce their chances of getting STDs. I mean, in 18 years we might have found a cure for AIDS, but that, even if we haven't, the point is you're doing a procedure that causes known harm now based on speculation about what's going to happen way down the line. That's not ethically justified, as ethical organizations in the US and other countries have said, and it's pretty much unprecedented in our Western medical practice. Dr. Margaret Somerville, founding director of the McGill Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law, and Canada's premier medical ethicist, has noted that a non-therapeutic intervention, such as cosmetic surgery, is only legally justified with the voluntary and informed consent of the person who undergoes the intervention. Infants cannot give such consent, adults can. Deferring the decision is one option which seems attractive. Males have the chance to have the procedure done later, and in case you're wondering whether that happens, it does happen. About 3 out of every 1,000 American males who's not circumcised at birth gets circumcised later. The other 997 don't. Whether you want to consider that as some indication of whether males are crazy about this procedure or not is up to you. We think it's likely that legal safeguards are going to continue to expand around these issues. They've expanded in the past. The general historical trend is concern comes up, an issue comes up, initially it's not given overall legal protection, and gradually the areas of liability expand. We think that's likely to happen with genital mutilation. We see it happening with female genital mutilation. The law has been passed in most developed countries and a number of third world countries. And we think it's only a matter of time before people start understanding that there should be some thought given to male genital mutilation as well. And they're not equivalent. I'm not equating them in any way. I'm not saying circumcision of a man is the same thing as circumcision or fibulation or excision of a female. They're different procedures. And they're both procedures done on non-consenting children or infants which cause verifiable harm. Now, no religious exception to this analysis exists, and anybody who thinks that a religious exception does exist is mistaken. First of all, there's no reason in principle to privilege Judaism and Islam over other religious traditions and cultural traditions around the world, such as a number of African cultures which practice circumcision as well. There may be a practical reason, given that there's a lot more people who are Muslim and Jewish in the circumcising first world countries, but there's no reason in principle for that. Beyond that, religious beliefs may lead the parent to seek circumcision. It's clearly not the religious beliefs of the child which are leading to the circumcision, and if you doubt that, go and watch a circumcision of a newborn baby boy. Even go watch one with analgesia. Definitely watch one without analgesia, and you'll see whether that boy wants that circumcision or not. Now, sometimes they do go into shock, it's true. They sometimes withdraw and go into a sort of withdrawal which looks like they're sleeping, but it's doubtful whether they're actually sleeping through a procedure that's as painful as it is. And by the way, there's a whole range of studies that I can refer anybody who's interested to that they've done on newborns and on children in the first year or two of life, showing how different behaviors are affected by having gone through the circumcision process. 6 months later with immunizations, it affects the mother-child bond, it affects a whole range of aspects of the newborn's life. We talked about ethics a little bit earlier. We've already had a number of legal actions regarding circumcision. Some of you may have heard that recently in the UK, a British man was awarded 800,000 pounds, which is 1.4 million US dollars, based on unsuccessful attempts to repair damage from a circumcision. There's been a number of successful suits in the US and elsewhere, and these have been based on procedures performed below the standard of care. They've been based on lack of consent, and as I say, the legal practice in this issue is continually expanding. George Deniston has shown, he's a physician, he's shown that infant male circumcision violates all 7 ethical principles of the American Medical Association. American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Medical Association have ethical guidelines which have been shown to be violated by this practice. Now, another interesting complication, in addition to death, which is one that might concern some of us, is urinary tract infections. They've been referred to. I'm not a doctor, but my understanding of the literature is UTIs are at least as problematic in females as they are in males, and I don't hear anyone proposing female genital mutilation for the girls. And my understanding also is that UTIs in males are relatively infrequent. 1% or 2%, I think, is the number I've heard. Again, you have to query whether performing a practice like this on 100 babies with guaranteed negative impacts on 100 babies is worthwhile doing on 1 or 2 babies. Now, what kind of harms am I talking about? Well, John Taylor had some research in 1996 in Canada which showed that the foreskin is richly innervated, very valuable organ. In addition to that, there's been a lot of psychological evidence, which granted is still anecdotal. However, you have to wonder, taking away an organ when you're born that's been created, been evolved for a purpose, often without analgesia, it's got to have an effect on you later in life, and does remove about half the tissue, half the surface skin tissue of the penis. Circumcision is basically an anomaly. Male circumcision is an anomaly in the developed countries, and a lot of Europeans and a lot of Africans have trouble understanding what the big difference is between male and female. And as I say, I'm not equating the two, but they have trouble understanding how we can make such a dramatic qualitative difference between the two. And I mean, obviously, I think they're right. I think there are differences in degree, but I don't think there are differences in kind. And I think ethics, law, and human rights will back that up. Nor does analgesia justify this experiment, and it is still an experiment. We don't have a firm medical justification for it yet. We're still trying to get the medical justification off the screen over there, but we don't have it yet, and yet we've been doing this for 100 years and, in the US and 5,000 years in other cultures. As far as laws go, I don't have time to discuss all the laws that circumcision might violate. Criminal law, assault, battery, child abuse, mayhem, fraud, possibly in terms of the information that's typically given to the patients, civil law, tort law, medical malpractice, assault, battery. There's just a whole range of things. As far as human rights go, international law takes precedence over national law. International law is incorporated into national law, either through treaties or through what's called customary law. So the US doesn't get saved from the impact of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by the fact that we haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because guess what? Every country in the world with a government, except the US, and I say with a government because Somalia hasn't ratified it either, but Somalia doesn't have a functioning government. Every country in the world has ratified the CRC except for the US. We don't get saved from its terms by that fact because this doctrine has been adopted so universally that customary law applies it to the US as well. There's other international treaties, Charter of the UN, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, American Convention on Human Rights, African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Germany awarded political asylum to a Turkish man recently based on his fear of enforced circumcision. The court said, quote, "There may be no doubt that a circumcision which has taken place against the will of the person affected shows a violation of his physical and psychological integrity, which is of significance to asylum. 2 UN reports recognize sexual assault on males, including circumcision, which they specifically mention, as torture and human rights violations." So this issue is starting to be recognized. I know I'm almost out of time. Just going to sum up here. Attempts to obfuscate the issue by saying that female genital mutilation is a lot worse than male. It's a nice try, and I myself agree that the average female mutilation is worse, but again, it doesn't justify the male practice. Chopping off someone's arm is worse than chopping off their finger, but chopping off their finger is still a human rights violation. Cultural brokers, it's been suggested physicians can act as cultural brokers for medically non-indicated practices. We have a long history in the US of acting as cultural brokers for all sorts of practices, Nestle Formula and all sorts of great things that we think up in the US and send to the third world when we don't want them here in our country. Well, I mean, granted, I'm not a doctor. My understanding of the practice of medicine is that we're not entitled to go around trying to find other countries to take on practices that we haven't proven yet in our own country are really justified, and I don't see the justification for doing that. But let's export to third world countries things that are really going to have proven value for them. So, in summary, health and human rights can exist together. We don't have to sacrifice human rights for health. We don't have to sacrifice health for human rights. This talk is entitled "Where Science, Health, and Human Rights Meet," but circumcision could be called a place where Victorian prudery, 19th century medical ignorance, and 20th century denial meet. Is circumcision a medical procedure? Is it a cultural procedure? Why are we doing this to our babies? Let's welcome the 21st century as a new millennium for the protection of children from this surgery, and for safeguarding the medical community from legal liability and human rights and ethical violations which can easily be avoided. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, and why don't we first have questions or comments on this paper, and then open it up to discussion on any of the topics that have been. So first, just comments on this.
Regarding the number of deaths from circumcision, the one off-the-cuff remark that was printed about 100 to 200 deaths each year in the United States was retracted by the person who wrote that. There have been, and the American Academy of Pediatrics has explored this, there have been 3 reported deaths over the past 50 years among the 70 million boys who were circumcised.
Well, I know that's not
no,
true.
I'm not finished yet. Concerning the risk for cancer of the penis developing if you threw up the risk of 1 in 100,000. That's per 1 in 100,000 population throughout the United States each year, and it's each year. It's not the whole duration of life. For the 20% of those individuals who are uncircumcised, during their 70, 80 years of life, the risk ends up being approximately 1 in 500. And I guess the last thing I'd like to address is the issues surrounding post-neonatal circumcisions for medical reasons. The estimates by most adult urologists are in the range of about 10% of men who have are uncircumcised as infants will have the procedure for medical reasons, typically pathologic phimosis and its complications later on in life. So rather than, I guess, making inflammatory statements, throwing out this, what I would, and listening to contentions, whether it's the contentions from me or from you.
Why don't we just
I
remind
think-
everybody?
Yeah, can I respond? Can I
We're
respond?
trying to keep the comments to 30 minutes each. I think that the discussions here have all been balanced and cordial without ad hominem comments, despite very different points of view. So I appreciate that. If you have a chance
Yeah,
to respond here.
Thanks. I appreciate Dr. Wiswell giving me a chance to respond. Well, as you probably know, since I'm sure you're familiar with all the research, there's been a number of studies of UTIs in Europe which have shown that not being circumcised does not produce a dramatic, terrible, catastrophic incidence of UTIs. In fact, there's studies in Denmark and other places showing that, guess what? Boys in Europe have lower incidence of UTIs than boys in the US. So the data is at least conflicted. There may be studies showing what you're claiming too, but the data is at least conflicted. Second point, 1 in 100,000, I see your point. So let's assume an average lifespan of 70 years. If we divide 100,000 by 70, that results in a risk of 1 in, 1,500 or something like that. So my basic point remains the same. You're proposing a procedure which causes known harm for a very speculative and very unlikely danger that only occurs at the very end of life, and it's due to a lot of other reasons, which include bad hygiene, and you know that as well as I know that. Third of all, as far as death goes, falsification, as I just talked about, of records is going on across the country. There's been more than one study showing the 200, 250 number, and I can quote those for you and send those your references to you after the talk if you'd like me to, Dr. Wiswell. And just common sense says that you're performing a surgery on 1 million, I think it is more or less, baby boys a year. There's going to be more than 1 or 2 deaths a year. Any procedure that's amputating tissue, and this is what you're doing, is obviously going to cause more than 1 or 2 deaths a year. Now, granted, these aren't being documented, and it's because of a lot of reasons. But
Okay, we have your point.
this is not rocket science.
There's
It's
a
really not
question
rocket
now from the
science.
back.
Sorry. While I was researching circumcision during my clinical practice at Mount Sinai in Toronto, I did come across one religious exemption. If your first 2 older brothers died at circumcision, the parents do not have to circumcise the third under Jewish law.
Thank you for that clarification.
That's true.
In the front.
Is the argument that circumcising a male helps to prevent cancer or other diseases is a legitimate argument, then the figure of 1 in 9 women getting breast cancer would also therefore suggest that all breasts should be removed. Is that something we wish to pursue as well?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. That was something I didn't have time to mention in my talk, but there's a study showing that for women at high risk of breast cancer, that if you have a double mastectomy and a oophorectomy, that it gives you something on the order of 2 to 4 extra years of life. And even for women with no elevated risk, removing both your breasts and your ovaries elevates your estimated lifespan about 8 to 9 months. And the difference, though, and this is a critical difference, is that the women who are going to be having this done are adults. They can consent to it, they're adults, they have the right to consent to it, and a lot of them don't, interestingly, even though the increased lifespan is dramatically more than any claims. I mean, nobody claims that you gain 9 months in average lifespan or 2 to 4 years from a circumcision. And even in that case, even with the ability to consent, which is an important human rights difference, a lot of women still aren't doing it. That's a very important point.
So an interesting analogy, yes.
And thank you, Stephen. You mentioned Margot Somerville, Canadian ethicist, and she brought out a number of things in a paper that she sent me that are really similar ethical points, issues around bodily integrity, consent, and so forth, if not in an emergency. But she differed from you in one critical area, and that was the idea of there being a religious or cultural reason to do this, where she made some points that those religious and cultural things which bind us may have some positive benefits for society or for groups of people, which may be a strong argument for doing it. I'm just wondering if you two have had discourse on this and you can explore it a bit for us.
Yeah, we have had discourse on it. Due to the shortness of time, I didn't have time to fully elaborate on the issue of the religious and cultural practices. But I actually agree with Dr. Svoboda on this issue. I actually think that the religious and cultural issues are subtle, and they need to be looked at with delicacy. And I've heard African scholars from the Third World saying exactly the same thing, that the problem is we have a very non-nuanced view of these issues, and they require delicate analysis. And the question still remains, however, of whether you can, you're permitted to basically decide your child's religion for them, or at least decide that their body's going to look like a particular religion's bodies do before they have the right to decide that. It's just laden with difficulties. That whole concept is just very problematic. And I think Dr. Svoboda agrees with me on that point.
So maybe I could just give a couple of highlights and then open this up for general discussion. We've heard first from Stephen Moses, who reviewed